Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Battlefield, Pennsylvania. Today we're filming on location at historic Fort Loudon in Franklin County. In the spring of 1765, over a group of 100 armed rebels, known as the Black Boys, surrounded and attacked a British garrison inside of Fort Loudon. By all accounts, it was the first time that American colonists opened fire on British troops. A full 10 years before the shot heard around the world at Lexington Green, many have long considered this event to be the opening stands of the American Revolution. Now, 2 centuries later, questions remain, and new interpretations have emerged, saying that James Smith and his rebels were not challenging royal authority, but actually enforcing it. I'm your host, Brady Kreitzer. Joining me today to discuss the Black Boys Rebellion of 1765 are historian Andrew Newman and senior archaeologist at the State Museum of Pennsylvania, retired Steve Warfel. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you to be here.
First, let us begin. How did you become involved in the Fort Loudon site?
Professionally, I'm one of the curators at Gettysburg National Military Park, and I've always had an interest in history, and especially local history, and supporting sites such as Fort Loudon, which has a wonderful, it's a wonderful area to come to, both scenic and the history that happened here. And typically, I like to support the staff up here with providing living history, and also volunteer to help the site out as I can.
And I got involved, Brady, due to my role at the State Museum of Pennsylvania. In 1980, I just started at the museum. Fort Loudon sits on Commonwealth, Pennsylvania property. And it was a matter of, at that time, of researching the background history of the site and then actually investigating it. The fort site had been discovered by archaeologists in 1977, but had not been investigated up to that point.
Now, as an archaeologist, Steve, I'd like to start with you. People have been living on this site for centuries. What made this site so attractive?
Well, its physiographic location is certainly an attraction for Native American peoples. You have the Conococheague Creek, which runs very near the actual fort site today. A lot of freshwater springs. Those would have been attractive to animals. And of course, the Native peoples were following the animals that were moving through the area. Likewise, you would have different stands of nut-bearing trees or berry-producing bushes, things of that sort that would have made it attractive as well. So you really are dealing with a landscape that provided lots of food resources, and that's what was drawing the Native peoples to this part of the landscape.
Now, you have been involved in a project that's found that people were living here long before the events that we're about to talk about tonight. Who were these people?
The Native peoples, well, gosh, we have evidence of Native peoples living here as early as the Paleo-Indian times, which is, anywhere from 8,000 to 9,000 years ago. And then we actually see evidence of Native peoples living here through the Archaic period, a very long period of time when there are hunters and gatherers. Now, none of these people are living in villages. They're just simply moving on the landscape, following the resources through the yearly round. But when we get into what's called the woodland period, then we start to see some small villages on this landscape, one of which we had the opportunity to investigate just south of the fort site in 1981. But they aren't tribes that we have names for. These aren't, there was no recorded history. We just know of them as people living during the late woodland period, but they had a distinctive type of pottery. They had arrows at that time. The earlier people only would have had spears. So it's characteristic of Pennsylvania prehistory, but we see people living here throughout time.
Let's jump ahead a few thousand years. Andrew, in the 1750s, the Conococheague Valley is an interesting place. What's going on here?
Well, there's a settlement that is wrapped around the Conococheague that flows from Maryland into Pennsylvania. And it's the Conococheague, referred to as the Conococheague Settlement, where you have Germans who live in the southern end and from basically Hagerstown up through Greencastle. And in north of Greencastle, you have what we refer to as Scots-Irish. So this area that the fort site resides on, what in present-day Mercersburg, was predominantly the north end of the Scott-Irish portion of the Conococheague settlement.
The Scots-Irish are an interesting people, very integral in the history of Pennsylvania. What was their story like when they arrived here, and how did they relate to the heart of the colony back east in Philadelphia?
Well, this area was considered the back country of Pennsylvania, and most likely of the British western edge of civilization. They were, and their German counterparts were basically allowed to settle out here and to serve as almost like a buffer between the elite out in Philadelphia and the treaty lands just over the mountains that we can see from the fort today, the Tuscaroras.
We also have to remember that the Penn government was a Quaker government, and that they did invite peoples from all over Europe to come and settle in Pennsylvania so that they could enjoy religious freedom and the like. So we see populations, particularly Scots, Irish, and the Germans coming into Pennsylvania. I don't think the Penn government ever realized that so many would come, because what we also see in the documents is that eventually they feared that they would lose their authority, that is, the Quakers would lose their authority to these people. So they were considered to be country bumpkins in a sense, but they, as Andrew said, that they also were viewed as serving a role, settling the frontier and providing a buffer for the elite Quakers that lived in the Philadelphia area.
Now, this site's selected for a fort, but it wasn't the first building here. Can you talk about what was here before that?
Well, I can take that one. Matthew Patton took out a warrant on this property. Actually, when I say this property, we're talking about in excess of 200 acres of land. That includes the area we know as the fort site today. And he took that out in 1744. And then over the next 11 years, he built a house, a barn, a log kitchen. And during an Indian raid in 1755 on this property, his house and barn were burned. Now, he and his family had evacuated or fled that property before the raid. There were numerous raids throughout the Conococheague Valley. So what happens is that you have a situation where he had a log house under construction but not completed, and somehow it was spared during the Indian raid. This would have been his second house that he was building, probably to accommodate the expansion of his family. But that was spared, and as a result of that house standing there, John Armstrong, who was given the authority to construct forts wherever there were standing structures, because there was an immediate need to try to protect settlers from these menacing Indian raids. Armstrong elected to take this house that Patton had not completed and put a stockade around it, and that became the site of Fort Loudon. And if we were to walk outside and see the fort site, we would see that it sits in a bit of a ditch or a valley. It's commanded by higher ground. Obviously, it's not a location that would be strategic militarily, but many of these locations were not strategic locations. They simply were quick, expedient places where you could put up a stockade and protect settlers from the Indian raids.
Andrew, I have a question for you. Is Fort Loudon the only fort in this area, or are there others?
At the time, before Fort Loudon was constructed by Armstrong and his men, there was a series of fortified homes, house forts in the surrounding area, like Fort McCord. Reverend Steele had a fort. Basically, anybody who had a home that was solid, fortified structure. A lot of supplies before Fort Loudon was constructed were kept at these house forts that were located all over. Whenever the fort was completed in the winter of 1756, when it was ready to receive stores, all these separate individual fortified homes that had supplies were all relinquished and brought here as a consolidated store point.
We have a site, we have a purpose. Let's talk about how John Armstrong saw this fort built. How would you have built a fort in the 18th century?
Well, these gentlemen who were involved, Armstrong would have been knowledgeable of the general plan of a fortification. As scholars, we refer to that plan as the Vauban plan. A French engineer by the name of Vauban had come up with a very simple design, but very effective design, which was basically a large square that had projections off of each corner. We refer to those projections as bastions. So Armstrong would have been familiar with that general plan of fortification. And that's what they tried to execute out here, although it's executed in a very unique way, a very different way, to the extent that the bastions are more like shooting platforms that are supported by exterior posts. That would have been the plan that you would see executed for all of these frontier forts.
This is done under the long shadow of the 7 Years' War. Could you catch us up on what that was?
When the fort was constructed in 1756, it was after Braddock's defeat in 55. There was no standing army left to defend this region in Pennsylvania. There were no militia laws, so there was no standing militias. This area was subjected to whatever kind of, I want to put it this way, savagery that the French and their native allies put into this region. There were a lot of families' homes that were burnt, farms destroyed, people taking back to the Ohio backcountry to be adopted into tribes. This was an area that was very heavily hit. Whenever the fort was constructed, it did provide some assistance in that way, but the site really started to get gain its importance when it was determined that they were going to reconstruct a road. They were going to build a road from Carlisle towards Fort Duquesne to eradicate the French presence, and that road being named after General John Forbes, the Forbes Road. And the Forbes Road was one that wrapped around Mount Parnell. Fort Loudon was a mile or two off of the Forbes Road, and allowed for it to be used as a substantial supply depot during that time.
Also, if we look at the 7 Years' War, which was this large contest in Europe between England and France, it spills over into North America because you have the French interest in New France, which we think of as Canada today. And then, of course, you have the British colonies. And it was in 1753 to 54 that the French start building forts down the upper Ohio River Valley, with the largest fort being at Duquesne, which Andrew mentioned. And that was seen as an immediate front to the British sovereignty in North America. So really, this event we refer to as the French and Indian War, and I think modern scholars look at it today as more as a war of empire. It is this contest between France and England that simply has spilled across the ocean. But it has great consequences, because France basically claimed all of the land of the Mississippi Valley. And that runs into the Ohio Valley as well. It's not until the treaty that results as a result of the end of the French and Indian War that Britain is able to cement its interests in North America.
Now, we think about the 7 Years' War, the North American theater, the French and Indian War, as Britain versus France. But odds are the settlers here weren't losing sleep over French soldiers marching into their rooms at night. You mentioned the Indian allies of the French. Talk a little bit about Indian warfare, if you could, and what the dangers of living in this region for these settlers was.
Well, Indian warfare was definitely brutal for the people like the Scott-Irish and the Germans that lived in this backcountry. Matthew Patton, as we mentioned, the namesake of the landowner here before the fort was constructed, had his house burned in 1755, and he was just in the process of completing his second one when Armstrong came in. So there are a lot of stories, a lot of accounts from that period, definitely covered in resources such as like the Maryland Gazette, the Pennsylvania Gazette. When we think of that period, we think of Mary Jemison, who's had an account of her family, number of family members being killed, house destroyed, and then herself and other siblings being taken by the native tribe to be adopted in the Ohio country. So very difficult time, and again, there was no protection offered by the Quaker government in Pennsylvania to help out these people.
And I think that many times people wonder who those native peoples were that were supported by the French. And many of them were Lenape Indians. We call them Lenape or Delaware Indians. But these are people that originally lived in the state of Delaware, New Jersey, eastern Pennsylvania, who had been pushed out of their homelands by British settlement. So they move west and end up in western Pennsylvania. They see the French as trading partners, but they don't see them as colonizers. And it's those peoples, I refer to them as dispossessed people. They've been dispossessed of their homelands, but it's those people who are very eager to attack the British colonists that have settled on the edge of the frontier, which at this time is right along the foot of the Appalachian Mountain. And that's why we see these settlements in the Conococheague being raided at that time. But they're French-supported Indian raids. The native peoples are getting the supplies they need to conduct these raids from the French. And if we look at this line of forts that's constructed in 1756 to provide safe havens to these settlements, that line of forts goes on a diagonal and it follows the topography of the Appalachian Mountain. So it sits at the foot. And that is the edge of settlement, British settlement at that time period.
Now, forts are used for defense, we know that, but they're also homes of diplomacy. Andrew, could you talk a little bit about the diplomacy that happened here in 1758?
In 1758, there was a need for Indian allies in the British Army, specifically in Pennsylvania, to be used to counter the France's Indian allies in Ohio and around Fort Duquesne. So there was an effort to procure the use of the Cherokee people. And so in 1758, in the summer of 1758 here at Fort Loudon, Colonel Henry Bouquet held a council with 300 Cherokee trying to gain their support in use of the war effort against the French. It was not successful, mainly because of the gifts that were promised versus what the authorities actually had here. So it was kind of a mixed bag. But if you can picture, Colonel Henry Bouquet meeting with some of the Cherokee chiefs, 300 Cherokee here, very, very impressive.
Out of the 7 Years' War, especially in Scots-Irish communities, heroes do loom large. And out of that war comes a name we're going to talk about a lot, James Smith. Who was he?
James Smith was born of a Scots-Irish family around present-day Fort Loudon, in between Fort Loudon and Mercersburg area. He was at age 18. He joined his brother-in-law, William Smith, had a log cutting operation in support of building Bird's Road, which was then a road in 1755 that was being used to link up with then Braddock's Road. So this James Smith, at age 18, is off of Bird's Road, in between here and present-day, I believe, Ligonier, Fort Ligonier, where he's off with a friend of his. They were cutting apart from the party, and they were approached by French allied natives that were scouting this log cutting operation. He was taken, his friend was killed. He was taken then to Fort Duquesne, where he was made to run the gauntlet, which was familiar with that, where you would have two lines of natives that would beat you as you run through these two lines. He survived, but he was beaten very badly. So at Fort Duquesne, he is being nursed back to health by a French doctor. He's somewhat interrogated at that time, asking if the men that he's with are well armed. He knows that they're not armed at all. They're just woodcutting parties, but he tells them that they're well armed, and meaning that each man has 2 arms. So he's being nursed back to health, but he's pretty confident at Fort Duquesne that when Braddock comes through, they're going to defeat this small French and native force. Well, he starts to understand he's in a bit of a pickle when he starts to see these French-aligned natives come back with British war trophies, grenadier hats, British coats, weapons, and he starts to get the idea that, hey, the Braddock army was defeated. He writes explicitly in his journal, which we'll talk about a little bit more, that he keeps during this whole time, is that he sees the prisoners that are brought back from Braddock's defeat burnt alive on the banks of the Monongahela, and about how horrific that was. He makes a lot of statements as to just being utterly shocked by this. After that, he is adopted into a Kanawha Indian tribe in the Ohio country, basically a band of hunters. He's adopted. That whole process he describes very plainly, and saying that all his hair on his forehead and his head is plucked out. He's taken down to the river, and the women wash the white off of him. And then he's adopted into this tribe and treated just like a family member. He actually takes the place of a deceased chief. He's not a chief, but he fills that void left when the chief died. So for the next 5 years of his life, he spends living as a family member of this tribe. It's not until years later he makes his way back home. There's a lot of that is captured in his Indian name that he was given is named Skua. There's a journal that's published out there. Most people use that source as a very valuable source of learning how these woodland peoples operated, especially in isolated areas such in the Ohio country. So that's in 1755, and in 1760 he makes his way back here, back to this area by way of, he makes his way from Canada. Somehow he makes his way back here, and comes back, and legend has it that when he gets back here, just a couple weeks or a couple days or weeks before, his fiance that he had when he left for the woodcutting party 5 years ago just marries. So how heartbroken is that? You come back here and your fiance marries someone else, just in that short a bit of time. So there we are, 1760, he returns.
Britain wins the 7 Years' War. A lot of people like to say they win the war, but they lose the peace. Steve, could you talk a little bit about what we call Pontiac's Rebellion, where that came from?
Sure. Excuse me. Chief Pontiac is one of the native allies of the French. And of course, after the Forbes campaign is successful in removing the French from the Ohio Valley, there's a treaty that's drawn between basically France and England. But Pontiac and a number of the tribes living in the Ohio Valley at that time don't like that treaty. So they take matters into their own hands. They attack the British fort at what became Fort Pitt, but they also attack other British strongholds. Eventually, there's confrontation between the British Army and Chief Pontiac and his allies at Bushy Run Battlefield. And at that point, the Brits prevail and the native uprising is put to rest. But it was considered to be another threat on the frontier, and it plays into the story here at Fort Loudon, because after the successful Forbes campaign in 1758, you would think that things are pretty calm, and they are compared to what they had been. So Fort Loudon's role switches from one of where it had been serving as a supply post, if you would, for the British Army proceeding west to go to Duquesne, to one of where it is now monitoring the types of goods that traders are taking west, because trade is again allowed to go west of this point.
And if I may add to that, Steve, is that to kind of complicate matters, in 1763 there was a proclamation of 1763, and it did a number of things. It prohibited squatting in the back country, treated lands to try to keep the peace with the Indians, but also it forbade the conveyance of goods of warlike nature. So any tomahawks, knives, gunpowder, lead, all those things were forbidden.
At the end of Pontiac's rebellion, what would you say is the status between settlers on the frontier and the native peoples of the frontier?
You know, if I could address that, it's still in a very tense period. At the end of Pontiac's rebellion, I think we all know of the use of Henry Bouquet's use of the soil blankets and the germ warfare. At the end of Pontiac's rebellion, the part of the treaty to end that conflict was the release of these Anglo-Americans that have been adopted into these native tribes. And it was a very difficult time because in some cases a lot of time had passed that a lot of these previous captives are now feel like they're family, and they're made to be separated from their native family. And in most cases that was a very tragic affair, but based on the logic of the period, that's what they decided.
Old habits die hard, I guess.
Yes.
Yes.
Let's go to 1765. You mentioned the proclamation line of 1763, restrictions on trade. Those laws are broken almost immediately. Who's responsible?
Well, it's a little bit of everybody. There are, just like I think today, there's markets. People make money off of certain markets that are available. Because of France being gone, Britain is now the only trade partner on the table for a lot of these natives that were previously dependent on French goods. So of course there's this clamoring, especially like in the Philadelphia and your larger East Coast areas, for sending goods and trading for certain items from these natives. So almost immediately, because of the illegal goods that are prohibited, there is breaking of that restriction, and that begins in March of 1765, and that's what brings Fort Loudon and James Smith into the fold, where you have in March there's this large convoy that's sent from Philadelphia by this company named Banton, Wharton, and Morgan. And they have this loaded wagons full of goods. This group of wagons, they go to Greencastle, where Pauling's Tavern. They're transferred to pack horses. 81 horses are loaded. And pack horses are used because even though Forbes Road was built, it was still a very treacherous journey to get over the Alleghenies. So March 5th, all these goods are loaded and heading up towards this area. And it's somewhere along the lines, history can be kind of fleeting, but based on accounts. But there's stories that a barrel of something was knocked over, marked something else, and scalping knives flew out. That demanded the attention of local authorities, magistrate in present-day Mercersburg, William Smith, Justice Smith or Squire Smith. was alerted to this. It set off a lot of interest in the area. And because one thing that happened in just a couple months before that, in June of 1764, was a massacre of school children and their schoolmaster in Greencastle, the Enoch Brown School. So there, a couple months before, there were a few, I believe, Shawnee Indians that came in and killed the school children and the schoolmaster at the Enoch Brown at this schoolhouse. So a lot of the people in the backcountry here in this area of Pennsylvania were still very well aware of the threats that were out there.
When this is going on, Fort Loudon is largely at the center, but when the Scots-Irish are angry about this contraband being sold, who is their anger directed at? Is it the soldiers in the fort, or is it back east?
Boy, I think that probably both, but soldiers at the fort are present. I mean, they're close, so you have that authority there. But I think that there's general discontent with the British authority at that time.
Can we talk a little bit about Fort Loudon itself? Who's in there? Who's commanding?
At that time, it was the 42nd Regiment of Foot, Highlanders, today recalled as the Black Watch, a very celebrated unit still today in the British Army. It was commanded by Lieutenant Charles Grant. And this unit, this was not the entire 42nd Regiment of Foot, but definitely a portion. The 42nd was dispersed at different forts in the colony of Pennsylvania after Bushy Run. But this unit was a very, as you could say, battle-hardened unit. Fought in a lot of the major battles during the French and Indian War. Was very much a part of Henry Bouquet's victory at Bushy Run. So you have a group in there that is very, very skilled in that day of warfare. But you also have different points of view. You have the locals here that, like I mentioned, William Smith, who look at the common law. British common law is the way to operate. But then you might have Lieutenant Grant and the Highlanders, most of which come from the Highlands of Britain or Scotland, which is part of Britain. And a lot of those might have, if they were older, they might have had experience during the Jacobite Rebellion, where use of martial law was in place and putting down riots and riot act. So you have those two different viewpoints kind of coming together here.
Earlier in the interview, we talked about James Smith. He comes back into the fold during this time period. What does he do?
James Smith, like I mentioned, I left off with him at 1760. Well, in 1763, with Pontiac's rebellion, he forms because there's no militia laws, he forms a band of volunteers, which are given the name the Black Boys. And the reason that they're given the name the Black Boys is because he instructs them in the way of the Indian manner of fighting. He doesn't know any way better to counter the natives than to fight like them. And so in his journal, he's very explicit in the way that he had them dress and operate. He wear a breech clout, green shroud, leggings, etc. And they operated in 1763, defending this area. By the time 65 comes around with this illegal pack train, full of illegal goods, himself, he's alerted by his brother-in-law, William Smith, and forms his group back together and decide to figure out what this pack train is. Because this 81 horse pack train is actually 4 times larger than the average pack train of the time. And when they get wind that it's carrying illegal goods, they fear that those illegal goods are going to be used against them, like what had happened a couple months before in Greencastle, Enoch Brown, what had happened from 1755 on with the Indian raids that wreaked havoc on this area.
We call them the Black Boys, the way they painted themselves in the Indian way. Do you think this was a symbolism on James Smith's part of his own Indian background, I guess you could say?
It was in that part, and also to conceal identity, I believe, because whenever they were in operation in 1763, they were operating on a lot of these known Indian paths and trails. 'Cause he knew how to recognize sign from sign of areas where these natives traveled, where at camp, how to operate like them, and I believe it was in part to kind of confuse the enemy, as well as to conceal identities.
We call the entire event James Smith, the Black Boys Rebellion. Could you take us through the events, piece by piece, that lead to what would ultimately be open combat between American colonists and British soldiers?
Sure. As I previously mentioned, in March of 1765, there was a large pack train coming through, offloaded onto from wagons onto pack horses. William Smith hears about this, that they could be carrying illegal goods. You get to around present-day Mercersburg, where supposedly these pack men, which are the names of the men who are in charge of leading this pack train, are told repeatedly to go to Fort Loudon, be inspected properly by Lieutenant Grant, be inspected. Of course, they refuse. This group has backing. They're being paid by Banton, Wharton, and Morgan out of Philadelphia, as well as George Croghan is involved in this thing as well, Robert Callender, a lot of these big money men, big dealers at the time. So they're coming through this area. They're repeatedly told to go back to the fort. It all erupts at a place we refer to as Sidling Hill, where the Black Boys, all painted up, surround and confront these packmen. They're told to, one last time, go back to the fort, be inspected. They refuse, they laugh at them. Then at that moment, James Smith and his men shoot a number of the horses, and with that, the packmen flee on the horses that they do have, and the story is that they were whipped as they ran to Fort Loudon. So can you imagine? So this happens. These packmen, of course, now they decide that they're going to run to Fort Loudon and tell the garrison there what happened. So they get to the garrison. They tell Lieutenant Grant that there was these backwoods people that confronted them and destroyed all the king's goods. Because at this point now they're calling them king's goods, not illegal goods. And so, of course, Lieutenant Grant sends his Sergeant Leonard McGlashan, and about a dozen Highlanders out to inspect the site. They get to the site, and they find this burning heap. And then they also find a couple men hanging out around there. Well, they go over to question these men, and whenever they notice that there's a little bit of black behind their ears, they immediately arrest them, and at the same time, there's 9 firearms laying around, which becomes important later in the story, that they also take. And they bring these men back to the fort and these 9 arms. And at which time, the James Smith, the other Black Boys and locals come to the fort. That was on March 6th. So a day later, James Smith and his men and locals come to the fort, demanding release of these men. They release the men, but they keep the firearms. So there's uneasiness right then and there for that period. In the beginning of May, there's another pack train that comes through, and this time it comes by way of Carlisle, and at about in a place referred to as Harris's Place. The Black Boys are again alerted that, hey, there's illegal goods coming through. They they do the same thing as they did at Silent Hill. They destroy the goods, whip the pack horse drivers. Pack horse drivers come to the fort, complain about this again. This time, Sergeant McGlashan and about another dozen Highlanders are sent out to pursue. And this time it's a little different. And this time they run into the black boys being camped at a place called Widow Bar's house. And there's a firefight that ensues. You have the Highlanders come in there. They see the black boys along the tree line. They start to engage, meaning they start to fire on the black. There's accounts of neither side knows really, who fires first. Of course, the Highlanders say that Smith and his men fired first. The Smith and his men say the Highlanders fired first. But anyway, the Highlanders take refuge in and around the Widow Bar house. There's about 30 black boys that are there. As this firefight is going on, about another 100, give or take, locals come to Smith and his aid. So all of a sudden you have, you go from 30 black boys to 80 to 130, and so what happens is that one of the black boys, his name is James Brown, is wounded, shot in the leg. Sergeant McGlashan takes this opportunity to use him as a bit of like a bargaining chip to get out of there. They're outnumbered, but nobody's being killed or shot other than this James Brown. This firefight concludes with each side going their separate ways. But again, James Brown is wounded in the leg.
So what brings us back to Fort Loudon?
So Fort Loudon here, we have a little bit of a disjointed idea. Each side, you have the British authority that are here, believing that these ruffians are out causing havoc, destroying the king's goods. But then you have the James Smith, the black boys, William Smith, believing that they're actually doing the British, what the British authority ought to be doing by inspecting these goods that are going through that go against the 1763 proclamation. There's disputes. The black boys under James Smith and William Smith decide that they need to set up their own inspection regime. In the surrounding area, any permit that comes in with goods that has the king's seal or inspection is considered invalid. So the black boys are issuing their own inspection. So they're inspecting these goods and then they're issuing their own pass, as you will, to say that these goods do not contain any warlike stores. Again, the 9 firearms are still being kept. Each side is pushing against the other. You have riot act mentality from the British authority here, the Highlanders. You have common law. Both sides are meeting. Nothing's being worked out. So then, at the end of May, Lieutenant Grant is kidnapped, taken to Squire Smith's house in present-day Mercersburg, made to sign a bond saying that that they were doing ill will. So all this tension's happening. Lieutenant Grant's writing back to General Thomas Gage, the overall overseer of British North America, at the time complaining about the insults being thrown towards him and his men, and it lasts all through September of 1765. And then in about between September and October 1765, you have somewhere along the lines, Thomas Gage decides that he's going to send a force from from Fort Pitt by way of Bedford to relieve and bring back the Lieutenant Grant and his men, close the fort. Okay. But what happens is, you can imagine, when William Smith and the locals hear about a force coming by way of Bedford, another segment of the British Army coming in, of course they view that as being, they're going to be put the rebellion down, because, again, Thomas Penn read the Riot Act, Governor Penn read the Riot Act to them just a month or two prior. So with the fact that Lieutenant Grant and his men still have these 9 firearms, and not knowing what this force that was coming in from Bedford was going to do, James Smith, his men, which is numbering around 30, and the local people, which is around about 100 or so, 100 to 200 people, local citizens, decide that they're going to surround the fort and demand the release of these 9 firearms. So for 2 days and 2 nights, and this is written explicitly, especially it's available in the Pennsylvania archives, Lieutenant Grant writes that James Smith and the local populace, light 20 fires, surround the fort, and fire on all portions of the fort, bastions, for 2 days and 2 nights. And not but one man was able to climb up on the bastion, at which time he was made to go back down. There's an account from Leonard McGlashan that they were basically made to lay on their bellies during those 2 days and 2 nights. What happened is that the fort was then surrendered under terms of giving up those 9 firearms to James Smith and his men. There were 5 rifles and 4 smoothbore arms. And Magistrate McDowell, another local authority, was brought in to be the negotiator between those terms. And when Lieutenant Grant and the Highlanders were leaving, within a mile of leaving the fort, they ran into that group that was being that was being sent here to escort and relieve them. So what would have happened if, the terms were not met, and, that relief column gets here and they see all these people firing on this fort with the British authority being held inside, being fired at? And, it could have turned out to be something a little bit more than that.
Is this the end of the Black Boys Rebellion? What happens to Smith? Is he punished for this, what would we agree to be open insurrection? It
depends which Smith you're talking about. James Smith, there's an incident in 1769, but because of what happens during this period, William Smith actually he has his legal authority stripped from him from the governor of Pennsylvania because of his dealings during this whole affair. But James Smith pops up again in 1769. One for a factual thing that happened, and the other for something that may have happened. What happens in 1769 is that he's on his way to speculate on some land in western PA when he is by Fort Bedford, and he is encountered by a couple of men on horseback. These men are some of Robert Callender's men. And I'd mentioned Robert Callender earlier with one of the backers of that 81 horse pack train that was destroyed, of which was, I believe, 3,000 pounds sterling that it was valued as to what was left destroyed. So James Smith with some other companions run into these men on horseback. When asked what his name was, James Smith relinquishes his name, at which time these men take pistols out and hold trained pistols on him. James Smith has a rifle, some type of gun, and wheels around with that. So there's a standoff. One of Callender's men attempts to fire his pistol. It misfires and kills one of Smith's traveling companions. During this whole incident, James Smith is brought to stand trial for the murder of his companion in Carlisle. He's eventually acquitted, but there are local people that are brought there to demand his release. But then I guess what you're going to ask about the so-called other event that happened in 1769. There's an account written 30 years later in his 1799 dissertation of his life. He talks about sacking Fort Bedford, and the reason being is that there was the black boys. There was this new group of black boys that attacked a pack train carrying, warlike stores. Even though the 1763 proclamation had been lifted, and you could distribute those items to natives in the Ohio country, this group saw to themselves that they would, destroy those goods, and so this new band was captured, held at Fort Bedford. James Smith gets the old gang back together. He gets the black boys back together, and they and the story has it that he at midnight finds the garrison of Bedford asleep. He goes in, he's able to release and free those black boys. And it's an account that he captures in his writings in 1799. But as from the British authority standpoint, we've never seen a document proving that. And so not to say that it didn't happen, but we still need to see that evidence.
By the standards, the Black Boys' Rebellion has ended. Now, since then, in the 200 years we've passed, we've heard a lot of different stories about this event. Some have said it was a regional rebellion. Others have gone so far as to claim it to be part of the American Revolution. You do have Americans shooting at British soldiers, but they're doing so to uphold royal authority. So here's the million-dollar question to both of you. Is this part of the American Revolution, or is it something different?
Boy, it's easy to ride the fence on this one because in effect, it's both. You do have this contest of rebellion against authority, which one could say is really the first shot of the American Revolution. But at the same time, from the other perspective, it could be simply viewed as civil disobedience, and there's no question that one could see it that way too. But historians really don't agree, even looking back after so many years, as to whether this one event can really be given that particular acclaim. But I think that there are so many other aspects of the entire French and Indian War period that sow the seeds for the American Revolution. All the British are moving out to western Pennsylvania to dislodge the French from Fort Duquesne. It's a horse-drawn army. The animals require forage. They don't have sufficient forage. Every time they would go to a local settlement to try to get enough forage for the animals, they would be charged extraordinarily high prices. And they were saying, well, gosh, we're here to defend your interests, your safety, and yet here you are charging us double what it should be. They felt that the colonists were not, in effect, not appreciating the effort that they were putting into defending the colonists' security. And at the same time, the British Army oftentimes was fighting arm to arm with provincials who were armed. And they viewed them to be, again, country bumpkins, but crude, poorly trained, etc. it sort of sets up false hope, to be honest with you. By the time of the American Revolution, the Crown thinks that it won't take much to put down the colonists because they're so poorly trained. Little did they know that it's more than just training that's involved there. But I think if you look back at this incident, it certainly is a contributing event of the American Revolution, but it's probably pushing it to say it's the first shot of the revolution.
Andrew?
Yeah, and I agree with all of what Steve's saying, and you know, but one thing is, and I've thought about this too, you know, reading what, you know, Thomas Gage, you know, he later ended up making some pretty terrible decisions, especially in the Boston area, and I believe that what happened here in the backcountry really contributed to his misunderstanding of what the people here on the frontier and what Americans in general were about. And I think, you know, the Americans, you know, us as being Americans and then British citizens, that's what we wanted to be. We wanted to be British citizens, and we didn't feel as though we were getting that type of respect. And all James Smith, the Black Boys, William Smith wanted was they wanted to be safe. They wanted to be able to live their lives, and they didn't want to have the threats of war and violence that they had lived through during the French and Indian War period. And they didn't, you know, they saw these, especially with the pack train and these illegal goods going through, they saw that as the beginning of another war, of possibly being in that same boat again. And they were just acting out of the necessity because they didn't feel like they were being protected. But I believe that it undoubtedly is part of a, as you can say, if you have a foundation, you know, that goes into what the American Revolution became. You know, definitely what happened here is definitely a block in that foundation.
1765, no matter what you say, we can agree is a major event in American history. How are we celebrating that at Fort Loudon?
This year, 1765 to 2015 is the 250th anniversary of this event. And to commemorate that, the last weekend in September at the site, there's going to be a anniversary commemoration of that. Where we're going to have different displays here, archaeological displays, as well as reenactors displaying what the 42nd Highlanders would have been doing here, what their actions are, plus the James Smith and the Black Boys and William Smith. And that is the weekend of September 25th through 27th, 2015.
On that note, I'd like to thank my guests, Steve Warfel and Andrew Newman, for joining us today. As always, if you have questions about today's episode or recommendations for a future episode, please visit our website at pcntv.com. For everybody here at Battlefield, Pennsylvania, I'm Brady Kreitzer saying so long.